Welcome to The Debate. Today we're examining Russia's strategic maneuvering in the global energy market. And we're looking at this specifically against the backdrop of some pretty severe disruptions to Middle Eastern supply lines, along with impending European Union sanctions.
Right. And the central question we're exploring today is really this. Is Russia's plan to preemptively halt energy supplies to Europe a demonstration of strategic market dominance and economic leverage? Or is it a reactive, forced adaptation that is basically masking deep domestic vulnerabilities?
Exactly. And this discourse emerges directly from recent internal transcripts and directives detailing statements from Russian leadership to government and energy officials. So my position here is that Russia is actually operating from a position of proactive strength. They are leveraging a profound global logistical crisis to dictate terms and solidify a long-term market share in the Asia-Pacific region.
And I will argue that this pivot is fundamentally reactive. It's essentially a forced march driven by the impending European bans, revealing a highly dangerous reliance on temporary price spikes just to manage crippling domestic debt.
So to set the stage here, we really have to look at the sheer scale of the catalyst that is handing Russia this incredible leverage right now. We're talking about the disruption in the Strait of Hormuz. This is a maritime choke point that up until recently handled approximately 1/3 of the entire global seaborne oil export market.
Yeah, it's massive.
Right. It's roughly 14 million barrels every single day, completely wiped off the immediate logistical map. So when Russia threatens to preemptively halt deliveries to the European market before the EU's planned bans take full effect, which, those start April 25th and culminate in a total ban by 2027 or 2028, they are effectively seizing control of the geopolitical timeline. Instead of waiting around to be sanctioned, they're proactively redirecting those vital resources to establish permanent, deep-rooted footholds in the Asia-Pacific region, all while maintaining the capacity to supply reliable Eastern European partners like Slovakia and Hungary. To me, this isn't a retreat. It is an aggressive, calculated restructuring of global energy flows on entirely their own terms.
I read those same internal directives, but I walk away with a completely different impression. When you actually analyze the rhetoric from the leadership, the entire strategy appears incredibly fragile. I mean, the shift to Asian markets isn't some organic, visionary choice. It is a strict necessity driven by the undeniable fact that the European Union is already planning to impose these restrictions and basically shut the door completely.
But they're the ones choosing to close it early.
Sure, but what stands out to me the most, and we definitely need to dig into this, is the internal mandate handed down to Russian energy companies. The leadership explicitly directs them to use their additional export earnings, not for innovation and not for expanding production capacity to capture this new market, but specifically to alleviate their debt burdens to domestic banks. Relying on an elevated price surge, which the leadership explicitly admits is, quote, inherently temporary in nature, just to keep domestic liabilities from sinking the banking sector, reveals a profound economic vulnerability. It's a strategy of pure survival.
While I'll admit the directive to prioritize domestic banks rather than immediately breaking ground on new pipelines does raise an interesting question about their capital allocation. But before we get to the debt, we have to grasp the physical reality of what is happening in Asia right now. The internal memos highlight that nearly 80% of those 14 million barrels passing through the strait were specifically destined for nations within the broader Asia-Pacific region.
Right. It's a massive regional shock.
Exactly. It's catastrophic for them. These are manufacturing-heavy economies that rely on constant, uninterrupted energy flows. You can't run petrochemical plants or logistics grids without fuel. Those nations are facing a massive, immediate shortfall. And the Russian leadership notes that storage facilities in the Middle East are filling up with oil that is impossible or at least exorbitant to export. Completely rerouting Middle Eastern oil without using the strait is explicitly described in the documents as simply unrealistic right now. It would take massive amounts of time and require building entirely new maritime terminals. By stepping in at this exact moment, Russia isn't just selling a few million barrels of oil. They are locking in reliable, long-term relations. They are stepping in as the savior when buyers are at their absolute most desperate.
I certainly acknowledge the severity of the supply shock. Trying to replace 14 million barrels a day on the fly is a logistical nightmare.
But that assumes this dynamic is permanent. Have you considered the durability of Russia's newfound advantage? This is essentially a massive play on geopolitical arbitrage. They are buying short-term leverage with a temporary crisis, but arbitrage windows always close. The internal transcripts we are analyzing explicitly state that the restoration of Middle Eastern production capacities will take, quote, not just weeks, but potentially even months. Notice the unit of measurement there, months, not years, not decades. The entire premise of capturing the Asia-Pacific market rests on a geographic bottleneck that is fundamentally temporary.
But months in the energy sector can permanently alter supply chain inertia?
Not necessarily. Once the Strait of Hormuz reopens, that logistical leverage evaporates entirely. The Asia-Pacific nations will suddenly have access to their traditional, cheaper Middle Eastern supply lines again. At that point, Russia's new foothold becomes highly contingent on ongoing geopolitical instability rather than superior economic competitiveness. They're rending market share during a crisis, not owning it through fundamental economic superiority. A distressed buyer isn't going to remain a loyal buyer once the distress passes and cheaper alternatives come back online.
I hear that. But I think you might be underestimating how trauma changes market psychology. Even if the immediate physical blockage is resolved in 6 to 8 months, the shock to the system alters the risk calculus of Asia-Pacific buyers permanently. The directives know that these political risks in the Middle East haven't just disappeared. Buyers need oil right now, today, but they also need to guarantee they aren't caught flat-footed like this again. When Russia steps in as a reliable provider that can route energy over land or from safer maritime borders, they are essentially offering an insurance policy against future Middle Eastern volatility. Furthermore, adjusting logistics away from the strait requires substantial capital expenditures from these Asian nations too. Once those new supply chains are forged with Russia, the inertia of international trade makes them sticky.
But if this Asian pivot is such a strategic masterstroke, and they are locking in all this sticky, long-term demand, how do you explain their stance on Europe? You praised their move to preempt the 2028 bans, framing it as an aggressive restructuring. But if you look at what they're actually saying behind closed doors, it paints a very different picture of their confidence.
Well, the European preemption is a punishing maneuver. The leadership is well aware that consumers are terrified right now. The memos note that world oil prices gained more than 30% in a single week, surpassing $119 per barrel. And gas prices are rising even faster than oil, especially since Middle Eastern LNG, liquefied natural gas, which isn't as simple as turning a valve. It requires highly specialized cryogenic ships and massive coastal regasification terminals, is completely constrained. By proactively halting European supplies before the EU is ready, Russia is essentially saying, "You can't fire me, I quit." They exacerbate the price pain for the EU while simultaneously enriching themselves at the peak of the price spike. It transforms a defensive vulnerability, the impending 2027 and 2028 bans, into an offensive weapon.
That is a great analogy, but I don't buy that it's a genuine I quit scenario. Let me tell you why. If shifting to the Asia-Pacific region is genuinely, as the text claims, a more interesting and promising permanent solution, then why does the leadership immediately extend an olive branch to Europe in these same meetings? Look closely at the phrasing. The leadership explicitly states that if European buyers suddenly decide to reorient themselves and ensure long-term stable joint cooperation completely rid of political influence, Russia has never refused them and is ready to work with Europeans too. They literally say, we need some clear signals from them.
I don't see that as a contradiction, though.
It is devastating to the premise of a total pivot. You do not publicly ask for clear signals from a market you are supposedly punishing and moving away from. If you have successfully captured a more lucrative, permanent market in Asia, you let Europe freeze in the dark to prove your point. The fact that they leave the door propped open, begging for depoliticized trade, proves that Russia still deeply desires and structurally needs the European market. It severely undermines the facade of an enthusiastic, proactive pivot to the East.
I view that completely differently. Interpreting that diplomatic positioning as economic desperation misses the power dynamic at play here. Offering to resume European trade strictly on Russian terms, specifically terms that are free from political considerations, is an exertion of dominance. The leadership is stating, in effect, we have alternative buyers in Asia who are desperate for our resources right now. But if you, Europe, want to abandon your political posturing and buy from us purely on economic terms, our door remains open. It forces the European Union to weigh their ideological commitments against their immediate, desperate need for energy, especially with prices spiking past $119 a barrel and LNG shipments virtually non-existent. This isn't begging for European capital. It is throwing a highly conditional lifeline to a freezing continent, provided they drop the sanctions regime. It is the ultimate display of having the upper hand.
That assumes the European transition away from Russian energy is purely a temporary ideological temper tantrum rather than a permanent infrastructural shift that is already well underway. The text explicitly notes Europe is planning additional restrictions starting April 25th. That train has left the station. The plea for a depoliticized relationship is a fantasy in modern geopolitics. Energy is politics. But I want to pivot to the bedrock of this entire situation, which is the economic fundamentals and domestic debt management. To me, this is the most revealing part of the entire discourse, and it ties directly into whether this is a position of strength or weakness.
I agree this is the critical layer. But again, the internal financial directives read to me like responsible, coordinated statecraft. The leadership is operating with immense macroeconomic foresight here. They acknowledge that the alteration in the equilibrium of hydrocarbon supply and demand will undoubtedly result in a new sustainable price reality. That is a permanent paradigm shift. In response, they are ordering the government and the central bank to take the entire process under control. They are directing Russian energy companies to seize the current moment and channel their additional export earnings toward reducing their debt burden and liabilities to domestic banks. This is a deliberate strengthening of the sovereign economy. They're using windfall profits to deleverage corporate balance sheets, ensuring that the domestic financial system is bulletproof against future Western sanctions or global market fluctuations.
Calling that macroeconomic foresight is incredibly charitable. It is essentially a bailout directive. The urgency in the internal communications is a massive red flag. The leadership explicitly states, and I'll quote the translation here, the current elevated prices for raw commodities are without a doubt inherently temporary in nature. They emphasize that this is a clear and undeniable fact that they fully grasp. So let's look at the reality. The leadership knows the $119 oil and skyrocketing gas prices are a fleeting anomaly caused by the Strait of Hormuz closure. And what is their immediate paramount priority with that temporary mountain of cash? It isn't investing in the massive new pipelines or maritime terminals needed to reliably supply the Asia-Pacific long-term. It isn't expanding exploration or production capacity to solidify this supposed new global dominance. The absolute priority is racing to pay down energy sector liabilities to domestic banks before the bubble bursts.
But that is just clearing the runway before takeoff. You can't build massive Asian maritime terminals or 1,000-mile pipelines if your domestic banking sector is weighed down by over-leveraged energy firms. The energy industry is incredibly capital-intensive. Deep drilling, legacy infrastructure costs, Arctic exploration. It all requires massive debt financing. Taking a temporary windfall and applying it to systemic debt is exactly what a prudent economic planner should do during a commodity supercycle, which is a period where raw material prices are historically elevated. It clears the board. By tasking the central bank to take control of this process, the state is ensuring that these windfall profits aren't squandered on stock buybacks or executive dividends, but are utilized to guarantee the structural integrity of the Russian economy. Once those liabilities are alleviated, the new sustainable price reality they project will fund the forward-looking infrastructure.
I understand the theory behind corporate deleveraging, but the context implies an alarming level of existing systemic risk. If your primary energy companies, which are the absolute crown jewels of the state's geopolitical strategy, are so heavily indebted to domestic banks that the head of state has to call an emergency meeting to redirect temporary windfall profits to save them, that is the very definition of vulnerability. A truly dominant economic power operates from a position of surplus. The fact that the survival of the domestic banking sector seems inextricably linked to a temporary disruption in the Middle East shows how fragile the ecosystem actually is. Think about it. If the Strait of Hormuz had not been disrupted and prices hadn't spiked 30% in a week, how exactly would those domestic bank liabilities have been managed, especially with the April 25th EU bans looming?
The Middle East crisis didn't create a proactive strategy. It threw a desperate, lucky lifeline to an over-leveraged system.
You make a fair point about the reliance on the price spike, but geopolitics isn't about what-ifs. It's about playing the board as it exists in reality. And the board right now features a paralyzed Strait of Hormuz, 14 million barrels of oil trapped, and gas restoration that will take months to untangle. The leadership is acutely aware that inflation is rising globally, and manufacturing of industrial goods is suffering worldwide due to these supply disruptions. They are weaponizing that exact macro environment. By accelerating the halt to Europe, they ensure the price remains elevated long enough to achieve their deleveraging goals. It isn't just luck, it is a highly synchronized application of geopolitical pressure and monetary policy.
But it is a synchronized application of pressure that relies entirely on factors outside of their control. That is my fundamental issue with calling this a position of strength. Russia does not control the Strait of Hormuz. They do not control the pace at which Middle Eastern production capacities will be restored. They are riding a wave generated by others. Let's look again at the memos regarding the Asia-Pacific. The leadership claims they will get a stable foothold in markets with reliable demand and long-term relations. Yet the text also admits that rerouting Middle Eastern oil away from the strait is currently unrealistic due to time and infrastructure constraints. This means Asia's current demand for Russian oil is highly artificial. It is a stopgap. Once the Middle East stabilizes, and the text concedes it will, in weeks or months, that Asian demand will naturally gravitate back to its historical, geographically closer, and likely cheaper sources. If Russia has spent its temporary windfall paying down domestic debt, instead of offering massive permanent price discounts or building insurmountable infrastructure advantages, they will find themselves squeezed out of Asia just as the European door permanently locks in 2027 and 2028.
Is affecting the entire framework of international economic relations. When an energy-dependent manufacturing economy in Asia watches 80% of its Middle Eastern supply vanish overnight and its storage facilities run dry while transport logistics gridlock, their calculus changes forever. Security of supply becomes paramount, superseding minor price differentials. Russia, by stepping in to fill this catastrophic void, transitions from being just another vendor to being a guarantor of sovereign economic security for these nations. That is why the text emphasizes building constructive relationships with Russia. The leadership understands that if they deliver during this peak crisis, the contracts signed now will be structurally embedded for decades.
Furthermore, by maintaining increased deliveries to reliable partners in Eastern Europe, like Slovakia and Hungary across multiple regions, Russia proves it can execute complex logistics despite Western pressure.
I would argue that maintaining supplies to Slovakia and Hungary is merely convenient, considering they are landlocked and heavily dependent on existing Soviet-era pipeline infrastructure. It doesn't necessarily prove global logistical agility. It proves a reliance on sunk costs. And regarding the Asia-Pacific, security of supply works both ways. If Asian nations are traumatized by the sudden loss of Middle Eastern oil, they will be equally wary of becoming overly dependent on a Russian state that is actively threatening to preemptively cut off Europe. They watch how Russia treats its legacy customers. The threat to halt deliveries without waiting for the door to be shut in our face signals to Beijing and New Delhi that Russian energy contracts are highly politicized instruments. They will gladly buy the discounted oil now during the shortfall, but they will not allow themselves to become as dependent on Russia as Europe once was.
That brings us to a natural point of summary for this discussion. Throughout our analysis of these internal transcripts and directives, my perspective remains that Russia is effectively weaponizing a global logistical crisis. The total blockage of a critical shipping lane, like the Strait of Hormuz, is a massive disruption, and Russia is utilizing this exact moment to establish permanent market dominance in the Asia-Pacific. By preempting the European Union's sanctions timeline, they dictate the terms of engagement from a position of economic stability. Furthermore, their internal directives to manage corporate debt using the new sustainable price reality demonstrate a highly coordinated, proactive statecraft designed to insulate their domestic economy for the long term.
And my summary remains that this strategy is a high-wire act of reactive policy. The pivot to Asia is less a strategic masterstroke and more a forced march driven by the impending reality of European sanctions culminating over the next few years. The explicit urgency to pay down domestic bank liabilities, using prices that the leadership openly admits are inherently temporary, exposes a severe over-leverage in their financial system. They are highly dependent on a temporary Middle Eastern crisis to stay afloat. The fact that they're still offering an olive branch for clear signals to resume European trade free of politics proves they know the Asian pivot is not a silver bullet.
Despite our distinct interpretations of the motives and vulnerabilities at play, I believe we found a significant point of convergence today. We both agree with the leadership's assessment that the global logistics of the fuel and energy complex are undergoing an inevitable fundamental change. The equilibrium of hydrocarbon supply and demand is shifting permanently, and the era of reliance on a single, vulnerable maritime choke point in the Middle East is fundamentally being reassessed by markets worldwide.
Yes, that is undeniable. The memos make it clear that the entire framework of international economic relations is being rewired in real time. The disruption has forced a global reckoning with how energy is transported, priced, and secured, permanently altering the risk calculus for both producers and consumers everywhere.
Exactly. And as we conclude, it leaves us reflecting on the profound complexity of untangling geopolitical strategy from stark economic necessity. Whether this maneuvering represents the birth of a new Russia-centric energy access in the East, or a desperate scramble to service debt before a temporary price bubble bursts, depends heavily on factors yet to unfold. Listeners should continue to analyze how the timeline of the Middle Eastern supply disruption will ultimately test the resilience of these newly formed international economic relations. The true durability of this strategy will only be revealed once the Strait of Hormuz reopens and the market finds its new, lasting equilibrium.